This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the member for Scarborough Centre for her question. The conclusions of this survey are clear. Hate speech has no place in our society. It is time to step up against online hate. The numbers are disturbing, but they come as no surprise. Almost half of Canadians report experiencing or seeing violent or hateful content online. Canadian wants us to act, and that's exactly why we intend to introduce legislation. Our approach will require online platforms to eliminate illegal content such as hate speech, terrorist and violent extremism, child pornography, and the non-consensual sharing of intimate images online. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Over the past year, this podcast has featured many guests engaged on issues related to internet platform liability and online content regulation. Daphne Keller, Heidi Torek, Eric Goldman, and Vivek Krishnamurthy are just some of the guests who have highlighted the policy challenges. Those issues are likely to come to the fore in the coming weeks in Canada as Canadian Heritage Minister Steven Guilbeault introduces new legislation designed to address online harms through increased regulation. There will undoubtedly be comparisons to other countries, but the Canadian legal environment, including jurisdictional limitations and the rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, means that simply importing another system rarely works. David Kaye is a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression from 2014 until 2020. He joins me on the podcast to discuss the challenges associated with balancing regulation and preserving freedom of expression online, the policy considerations that government should be thinking about, and the risks that arise from getting the balance wrong. David, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, Michael, my pleasure.
Yeah, it's terrific to have you here. The issues around freedom of expression and online regulation in Canada anyway are taking off, and we see it taking place with heightened interest, I think, in a lot of jurisdictions. And so you're a perfect person to kind of walk through some of the challenges. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that you served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. That's always a mouthful.
Yeah, total mouthful.
It is for sure. From August 2014 until July 2020. So you're there in that role for a really long time. Can you describe a little bit about that role and the kind of work that you engaged in?
Yeah. So, again, Michael, thanks for having me on the program. Special rapporteurs, there are about 50 of them. These are positions that are appointed by the Human Rights Council. So we're basically, appointees of the central human rights body of the UN system. It's part of the General Assembly. And, the way the special procedures is what it's called, the way special procedures is organized is basically around either country-specific human rights concerns. So there's like a special rapporteur for Myanmar and Iran and North Korea. But the bulk of them are independent experts on thematic areas. So freedom of expression was my focus. There's freedom of assembly, privacy, cultural rights, kind of a lengthy list. And what rapporteurs do, it's basically two kinds of things. On the one hand, and just speaking from my own experience, I would monitor state behavior in the area of freedom of expression using the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19 of the ICCPR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as kind of the touchstone for that kind of evaluation. And I would do thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And those two different things, looking specifically at government behavior, and secondly, looking at general trends, would basically combine and overlap one another pretty regularly, but they were conceptually different tasks.
Okay. So pretty broad mandated geographically, although obviously focused on a particular issue. I'm going to assume that a lot of things may have changed over the course of the term, but I'm
Yeah.
guessing that few more so than really the public discourse around the internet and internet platforms. If I think back to 2014, when you started, the public perception was generally pretty positive about the internet and the big tech companies. But as we know, by now, we've seen a really significant shift in perspective. Can you talk a bit about how you experienced that change and the impact that it had on promoting and protecting freedom of opinion and expression?
Yeah, I mean, I think your recollection and your read of the change is mine, and I share that. When I started, we're sort of at something of a pivot point, because I started a year after the Snowden revelations, and the Snowden revelations, although they were focused on on surveillance, they also brought to the fore the question of private corporate engagement with government action, with government acts. And so early on, the discourse, at least when I started, the discourse around tech space and around internet platforms tended to focus on the pressure that governments were placing on the companies. So thinking back to Yahoo in China, for example, right? The idea that governments would demand censorship of the companies, or they would demand user data from the companies, or whatever it might be. That seemed, in my recall, that was just tended to be the focus of much of the discussion, but it moved fairly quickly to this broader question of how the companies actually govern their own space. So even outside the shadow of government regulation and government pressure, what are the companies themselves doing, either to ensure robust freedom of expression, or what are they doing to control harassment, incitement to violence, even in the context of Myanmar, incitement to genocide. I think that if I were to kind of at a high altitude look at the change, it would be that change from a focus on government pressure to the focus on on company governance.
Yeah, no, there definitely has been an increased focus, and now we're starting to see, of course, a lot of additional government pressure on the companies, but it's different governments from the way it was a number of years ago.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the interesting things is how the government we're in a way coming full circle, right? I mean, if we started with the concern with government pressure, and then we moved a little bit towards, although we never lost that concern, but we moved towards the concern over corporate governance, we're now sort of moving back a little bit to the question of government pressure that's not on individual speech in the same way that it might have been in the past, but government pressure on the companies in order to better govern their space. And I think that is the nature of the regulatory debate right now worldwide.
I think that's true. I mean, to what extent are you seeing it within those debates? Where is the freedom of expression aspect to that discussion? I can tell you that from a Canadian perspective, we sometimes get the sense that the responsible minister and the government as a whole has become so focused on battling with the companies and saying you've got to do a better job governing your platforms, that the impact or the implications for freedom of expression are sometimes taking a back seat as part of those considerations.
Yeah, I think that's totally true, and that's true everywhere. I mean, the focus, and I understand it. The focus on harms is coming from a place where I think many governments believe they have responsibility to protect individuals, to protect communities, to protect democratic processes, whatever it might be. The problem, and this is a problem in, maybe mostly in democratic societies, because in the autocratic, authoritarian world, they're not kind of worrying as much about, whether the language is overbroad or something like that. But in democratic society, I think there's this real kind of clash of interests. On the one hand, dealing with the harms. On the other hand, the resistance to definitions that are so broadly written that they might put excessive discretion in the hands of government to clamp down on legitimate speech. And I think that's just been a very hard conversation to sustain with governments and with communities over time across, North America, Europe, other democratic spaces.
Yeah, no, I think we're seeing that play out in a lot of places. Now, your book, Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, I think touches on some of the things that you've just mentioned and some of those tensions. You identified in it some of the guideposts you thought for navigating some of those kinds of tensions. What do you think countries should be thinking about as they, on the one hand, as you say, try to address the harms, try to ensure that their citizens are adequately protected, but at the same time not lose sight of some of the fundamental freedoms that are so essential as well?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's, this regulatory debate, and I mean that's happening. Regulation is going to happen. I'm kind of probably like you concerned that regulatory move will not take into account speech values as much as they should. But I do think there are some kind of basic rules that could guide, let's say, smart regulation. I mean, one is, I think one of the kind of the underlying problems here is the lack of transparency into what the companies themselves are actually doing. How do they adopt rules? What is the nature of those rules? How do they apply those rules? Because, so often when governments or the public is concerned about platform governance, it tends to focus around the sense of either inconsistent application or, sort of the application or enforcement of rules only when, there's public pressure and so forth. And so I think there's real space for regulation to, at least at the outset, to focus on rules of transparency and really giving access to the public to know what's happening. Also, something that I think scholars have had a real hard time with, which is getting access to, to the platform, to their APIs, to all sorts of, looking under the hood so that we can actually know what's happening. To my mind, that's kind of a first level approach that, other things can follow from it, but we really do need to, instead of thinking only about breaking them up, and the competition discussion is an interesting one that's related, we should also be thinking about kind of breaking them open so we can actually see what they're doing.
So transparency as step one, and I think you're seeing a lot of momentum around that. I know talked about a human rights-centered approach. Is that where we start moving into step two? What are some of the other kinds of things that you think we ought to be thinking about? Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine. So I'm really wary. And this probably comes from just my, I was, educated in a First Amendment environment. I believe in the First Amendment, and I'm very wary of, of government basically saying to anybody, but certainly saying to the platforms that their rules need to be X, Y, or Z. That they should. I'm wary of government rules that are not viewpoint neutral, and so what I do think government can say as part of the regulation is kind of leading them to identify what are the sources for their decisions. So where should they look to make their decisions? I mean, some of that should really be terms of service and the kind of, let's say, branding that any of the companies want to have. I mean, they also have, free association and free speech rights themselves. What kind of platform do they want to design for their users? But I do think that they can provide some kind of guardrails around that. And they could say, for example, impose some requirements on the company so that they do due diligence into the impact that the platforms have on the rights of their users and the rights of the public. They could basically say, we want you to guide your governance of your platform according to human rights standards, given the scope of your role in our societies. I mean, I do think there are steps that can come from government that are short of telling the companies they have to, keep up or take down certain content, but give them kind of the framework for how they make those decisions.
Okay. In your mind, this is the question I get asked a lot. I might as well ask it of you as well. Is anyone doing it right or doing it really well, particularly, I suppose, from a government-oriented perspective right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're in such a moment of flux that it's hard to identify really good practice right now. I actually think that the model that tends to, like, if we, taking a step back and looking at things from a pretty high altitude, I think the European and North American approach of, very light regulation generally, although we could talk specifics as well, because it's not light regulation everywhere, but the general approach of allowing the companies to make these decisions according to their own standards has worked fairly well, I think. I mean, it's worked from the perspective of innovation. It's worked from the perspective of, vastly increasing the kind of the space for access to information and for the imparting of information. Freedom of expression as both, the recipient and the imparter, and so the speaker and the audience. So I think there's been, I don't think want to throw that away as we think about the regulatory moves going forward. So, at a certain level, I would say, the regulation that we've had so far isn't so bad. It's that what we have seen over the last several years is just, abuse of the platforms, harassment on the platforms that the platforms themselves haven't been able to deal with. And we need to find the mechanisms that deal with those harms in a way that doesn't overstate the harms and also use language that provides, either so much authority to government or so much uncertainty for platforms that they take down a lot of perfectly legitimate content. So I know I didn't exactly answer your question. Maybe you can answer it for me and tell me how you answer. But I find it to be, we're in such a moment that it's hard to say there's a good or even perfect practice, considering the kind of regulatory initiatives that we see out there right now.
Yeah, no, it's a question I struggle with as well. It's one reason why I wanted to see if perhaps someone else had a better answer.
I don't have brief talking points that you could just walk away with, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's not an easy one because these are really challenging issues, and I think you're right. I think we're seeing a lot of the different policy considerations in flux. I mean, a good example actually of a policy that's in flux that some would like to see changed, but at least from my perspective has generally worked well, although it would benefit from some tweaking, is CPA Section 230 sub C, the safe harbor. Obviously, an enormous amount of pressure to see some change on that issue. We're having some of the discussions in Canada as well around it, and it was included in the trade agreement with the United States. What's your take on the safe harbor approach?
Yeah, I mean, I that is one area that I would say is a positive. I mean, I think that, Section 230, as much as it, I think in the U.S., and I know you've watched this debate and participated in this debate, it's so highly politicized that, the safe harbor approach, it has kind of been wrapped up in the overall sense that the platforms are the bad guys. The platforms are seeking to undermine conservative speech, or undermine, difficult voices, or they're part of cancel culture. And I think that, even those voices calling for that, if they actually kind of sat down with experts and walk through what it is they're trying to achieve, my guess is they would find, as you said, that there's real value, and there has been real value in the safe harbor and, that general approach for sure. I think, if I could say just going back to your question about, good practices out there, because there's one example that I've used with people that is one that didn't actually come to fruition, let's say, and that is in France. They created this panel, basically it's like a commission to study regulation of online space, and they came up with this basically a multi-stakeholder framework for addressing issues of content online. And it was actually a pretty rich proposal that the government didn't take up, even though the government had commissioned this body to do this research and make proposals. But I think there are proposals out there, and that even democratic governments that see the harms but also want to protect freedom of expression, they're out there. There are proposals and models. They just need to be taken up.
Yeah. No, you speaking of cancel culture and the role of the platforms, nothing I don't think got as much attention around this issue earlier this year than the deplatforming issue, especially with respect to President Donald Trump, President Donald Trump,
the former guy.
Yeah. What were your views really on how the companies, and it crossed the broad spectrum from everything, of course, Twitter and Facebook to even Shopify and others that all took steps in this regard. What was your view on how the companies handled that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, in my view, they did the right thing, but it was very messy getting there. And they seem to be treating the online, the disinformation. And in Trump's case, it was, disinformation that was very much linked to incitement. And we could have, kind of a technical legal discussion over incitement and what it means. I think that the platforms were, first of all, they were probably seeing a lot more than we saw. Certainly, they saw, for example, interactions between Trump's account and, let's say, QAnon accounts or others, and certainly on the right, that were, seeking to foment a kind of environment that's ripe for incitement, that's ripe for violence. And the companies across the board, but certainly the biggest companies, they started by giving warnings and by placing labels on different kinds of content. But I do think that there was a kind of a broader sense of context that it took them a long time to figure out, that they weren't necessarily, although again, we don't know because they're so opaque, but they weren't really focused on taking steps to deal with the kind of context that emerged, both the context after the elections in November in the United States, and the context as we were getting closer to January 6th, when it became clear. I mean, certainly in the weeks leading up to it, it became clear that Trump was expecting and inviting violent forces to Washington to try to stop, the count of electoral college ballots. So, I mean, I guess my overall view is the platforms took too long. They ended up getting to the right place in dealing with a real kind of harm, and that this is one of the reasons why they need to be more transparent, so that people can actually evaluate both the steps that they take and the reasons why they take them.
I think it's a great point. The transparency would make a huge difference in terms of at least the ability to engage in some sort of analysis or discussion as to what they'd done and whether or not it was the right thing. I recently had my colleague Vivek Krishnamurthy on the podcast, and Vivek was talking about one of his concerns with what we see taking place from a number of democratic countries as they move forward with the kind of regulation that we've been talking about, and his concern that can often serve as a model for countries that we might see as less democratic, where they'll say, well, if Canada's doing it or France is doing it, the United States is doing it, then why shouldn't we be doing the same kinds of things? I'm wondering, in your experience, as you were taking that really global perspective, did you see that play out, where some of the less democratic countries are able to effectively to point to approaches where freedom of expression may take a back seat in certain respects, and they say, well, listen, if those countries are doing it, there isn't any reason that we shouldn't feel free to do so as well?
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely is happening. I mean, there's been some good research that shows how Germany's Network Enforcement Act, the NetzDG, has been kind of cut and pasted, into authoritarian, or not even just authoritarian, but into environments where freedom of expression is not valued at the same level. So I definitely see that point. I mean, we also saw that in the context of the development of, terrorist content regulations in Europe, or even the rhetoric around terrorist content, because, since at least 2014, 2015, particularly after the Charlie Hebdo killings in Paris at the beginning of 2015, we saw the rhetoric in Europe, to a certain extent in the United States, but especially in Europe, moving towards, we need to do everything we can to shut down terrorist content, and also, what they called extremist content. And that, that's exactly the language that authoritarians love to hear, because at the same time that Europeans were talking in those terms, Turkey was redefining journalism as terrorism. Egypt was, prosecuting journalists for quote unquote terrorism or extremism. And this kind of approach that was really deeply repressive, was happening all over the place. Those countries would probably have found those tools anyway, but the democratic countries, in a way gave them a little bit of fodder, at least gave them a talking point that, conceivably in the kind of whataboutism of the day, they could use, to throw back at some of those countries when those countries came to criticize them.
Yeah. It's interesting that those examples are really important, particularly for, I think, countries, in Canada would be one of them, that likes to see itself as playing a model for countries around the world, and to recognize that cuts both ways depending on some of the policy choices that get made.
Before you get to a question, there's one other thing, because I think that your work has also touched on this in a big respect, and it's an intersection between like the content and the sense of urgency that governments often impose to say, you need to take this down quickly. And this particularly, like we saw this especially in an area that shouldn't be quite as emotive, in copyright, the copyright directive in Europe, where, the pressure in Europe is to take down content as quickly as possible, like 24 hours, 48 hours. And that part of it, which isn't necessarily content specific, that actually is something that we're seeing borrowed by authoritarians, which is really pushing the companies to take down a lot more content than they should be. It's taking down either, content that isn't or shouldn't be copyright protected, or content that is, journalism. It has nothing to do with terrorism. And that kind of pressure, I think, is, it's not content specific, but it's pretty real, I think, for the companies, and then ultimately for individuals who are subject to those kinds of pressures.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that. Just earlier this week, we had a report here in Canada where the government is moving forward, or plans to move forward, with new regulation of internet speech, social media companies, and the like. And precisely the issue you raise about the need for speed when it comes to content removal is one of the things that's been cited. And the issues around due process, getting it right, not removing more than is necessary, or lawful speech, kind of, again, it seems, if your prioritization is get this down immediately or face liability, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's going to have quite
Totally.
clear implications for freedom of expression.
Yeah, totally. I mean, what it really is moving the companies to do is to develop basically algorithmic tools to take down content. And those have a pretty significant fail rate in terms of taking down legitimate content. And I guess a success rate in taking down legitimate content. And I just think the pressure to this kind of, we talk about them as upload filters. I mean, this pressure to filter content so fast is likely not to work out well for the public and its right to enjoy freedom of expression over time. I mean, it's a pretty big concern that I have. I mean, in part it's because the companies are so huge. I mean, they need algorithmic tools to at least sift through and know what they need to be looking at. But they're so far from the places where they're actually governing, expressive space that, the further you are from the core, like democratic large markets, the more they're going to, I think, unfortunately, sacrifice robust freedom of expression to protect their own business interests in those markets.
Yeah, no, I think the risks are very real. Let me close with this. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the website blocking side. You just mentioned upload filtering is, of course, the filtering or the blocking going the other way. You submitted what I thought was a really essential submission during a Canadian consultation on the issue. And there are some indications that the issue will resurface, potentially, certainly in copyright and even potentially, I think, with respect to some of the kinds of speech that we're talking about, where the platforms may be asked to remove content quickly. And if it's platforms that fall outside the jurisdiction, one wonders whether or not the government will start saying, well, maybe we should engage in site blocking to do that. Can you talk a little bit about your experience around the site blocking issue around the world and some of the risks that it raises?
Yeah, I mean, so website blocking has become a kind of a go-to tool for governments around the world. I mean, even ostensibly democratic governments like India for the last several years has really quite liberally used the tool of blocking websites. And it's two different ways of thinking about it. I think one is website blocking and filtering often involve government directives to telecommunications companies. So, it's a different space than, ordering Facebook to take down a page, because, Facebook conceivably could say no. And, the government might not have too much of an option in terms of what to do with that with Facebook. I mean, they could shut down the platform altogether in their country, but, that's not going to be a very popular move in most places. But with the telcos, they have licensing arrangements. They have a lot of law that gives the government real discretion over, and this is true for most countries, real discretion over what they can tell those companies, ISPs, telecommunications companies, tell them what to do. And so certainly in democratic countries, I think that argues for really clear rules around what are the constraints on government to make orders to filter content. And too often those orders are disproportionate. It might be a concern with one particular set of content or posts or something, but the order goes to take down an entire site or to filter an entire site. We just need to make sure that in places like Canada, the United States, in European countries, other, democratic countries with strong rule of law, that, when they're adopting law around these issues or adopting regulatory measures, they really put the onus on government to demonstrate the necessity and proportionality of their action and provide room for, appeal and due process. And I'm concerned that, particularly in combination with that timeliness issue, that they're not always moving in that direction.
Yeah, no, David, there's a difficult conversation. It's a great conversation, but a difficult one just to see how many hotspots, in a sense, across the policy spectrum there are right now. And there's no question, I think people would agree that there is a need for regulation to adapt to the current environment, but doing so without learning the lessons about what it means for some of our other fundamental freedoms, raises, I think, some really troubling potential outcomes of where we might be headed.
Yeah, I could not agree more.
Okay. Well, David, thank you so much for highlighting these issues and for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure, Michael. Thanks.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.